starting to get enough people here. We're going to give people just one more minute, and then we'll dive in. We're excited to chat today. All right, Reese, you ready to go? You want to get going here?
Yeah, let's do this.
Cool.
Let's do this.
All right, I'm going to be admitting people while I'm chatting here. So, for those of you that don't know us, Reese and I are the co-founders here of Domestique. Domestique is a fractional go-to-market operations agency. We're based primarily in the Front Range of Colorado. We got people all over. We're fortunate enough to have 42 people here now, which is very exciting. We are going to be talking about capacity planning today. For those of you that don't know, capacity planning, I mean, if you're on this call, hopefully you know what it is. And if you don't, and if you haven't started, good luck. Capacity planning is essentially the exercise of defining your annual revenue targets, but more importantly, how you're going to get there. Given that we are well into 2024 here and well into Q4 here, a lot of our clients right now are focusing on their 2025 capacity plans, and they are well into the process. And so what we're going to try to do today is focus on a lot of the common mistakes that we see CEOs, CFOs, and different revenue operations leaders make, so that hopefully you don't make the same mistakes. We're going to save questions until the end just so that we can get through the spiel. If you've got questions in the chat, throw them in there. I know we've got a couple team members on here, and they'll make sure that the chat is lively. Cool. Okay. Reese, you wanna keep going?
Yeah, let's jump in. So excited to chat today. As Alex mentioned, if you got questions, toss them in the chat, and we'll kind of respond back to them as we're kind of getting into it. And then we'll have 15 minutes here at the end to kind of chat through this. So we like to baseline everything in what we're talking about is what is revenue operations, because one of the things that we have found is oftentimes there are multiple definitions of revenue operations, and I think walking through that will help inform our conversation around capacity planning today.
Yeah.
So we look at revenue operations as the connective tissue across the customer journey.
Yeah.
Specifically, when we think about this, we think about the entire customer journey. So truly product, marketing, BDR, sales, PS, CS, support, all in alignment with finance. Across that customer journey, we think there's 5 work streams, and the order is important. The first is what we call planning, or this is really your go-to-market strategy. This is everything from who's your ICP, or an account-based marketing shop, are you using some sort of revenue methodology like a BANT or a MedPick? As a part of this go-to-market strategy, it is inclusive of your capacity planning. So thinking about how are you thinking about capacity planning for next year? The second is process, right? This is the things you do on a day-to-day basis to make sure whether you have one person on a team or 20 people, everybody's running the same play. So BDR gets on a first phone call. What are the questions they're asking? How are they putting it into the CRM? Those types of things. The third is tooling. This is not just your CRM, but the entire tech stack that touches your customer journey. And it should be set up based upon that strategy and the process. Fourth is data. Data comes out of your tech stack. We are big believers in 3 things about data. 1, only measure what you can make a decision around. So you don't need 500,000 dashboards. You need just the dashboards that you're going to make decision around. 2, data's got to fly at the right altitude. So if we're having a CEO, CFO conversation, we want to be at that 60,000 feet, the 60,000 foot view. If we're having an operator conversation, it's probably more 6,000 feet. And then 3, data needs to be presented in such a way where the end consumer of data actually understands what it means and can then go make a decision around it. The last work stream is enablement. So we think of enablement in 3 buckets. 1 is skills. How do you multi-thread? How do you have an executive conversation? 2 is tooling. How do you use the tech stack? And 3 is competition. How do you position yourself within an industry? The reason why we think this is so important, particularly in the context of today's discussion, is what we are doing with capacity planning is taking that go-to-market strategy, codifying it into a model, and then coming up with a process and data around that process in which we can track it on a regular basis to be able to say, are we on track or are we off track? And if we're off track, what are we doing about it?
Awesome.
So yeah, with that, we're going to kind of jump into our discussion of capacity planning. And one of our goals today is like, we want to make sure everybody leaves here with like tactical next steps. So hopefully this gets down in the details of actual things you can do here.
Cool. Love that. So what is the problem with most capacity planning processes? We think there are a few. One, we think they start too late. I made this joke earlier. If you are sitting here on October 24th and have not started your 2025 capacity planning process, you are late. One of the more common issues we see is that the capacity planning models and teams contributing inputs to the models are relying on different definitions. And this gets really tricky really quickly. So we're going to spend some time here. A lot of capacity planning models do not align the top-down targets with bottoms-up expectations. We're going to spend a lot of time on this one. And this one is near and dear to me because I grew up in the marketing world. Most capacity planning processes ignore marketing. You should never ignore marketing because we're going to find a way to get in there anyways. And then, yeah, I know. Reese could care less. But he's happy when all the marketing source pipeline starts showing up. And then most capacity planning processes are not held accountable. They're a one and done meeting process, and then it's an Excel file that no one ever takes a look at. So we're gonna talk through each of these.
Cool. All right. The chat is very quiet, so if there's questions coming along, please don't hesitate to reach out. We know that we're fighting lunch depending on which time zone you're in, so we will do our best to make this entertaining. All right, so we're going to jump into the first thing that Alex mentioned, so timeline and process. So when we think about capacity planning, what's interesting is like we think of like it in 5 steps. Now, what most organizations that we see, they typically just do one step, and it's that third bullet point there. This is a kind of top-down board set of expectations. Like the board wants us to grow by 50% next year. It's like, all right, 50%, let's make sure we got all the quota on the street and we're going to communicate to everybody. It's usually just that one. But we actually think it should be done in kind of 5 steps. So the first one is what we call stage and definition alignment. One of the things that we see when we work with a lot of customers in and around capacity planning is we'll come in and as we start to build the reverse waterfall of like working backwards from whatever the number is, we'll sit down and say, all right, what's your definition of MQL? We may get 5 or 6 different definitions of that. Yeah. So it's making sure everyone is aligned around all the definitions all the way down through the funnel. You may think that this is defined, but I would strongly encourage you, if you've not done this, I would ask people, hey, do we all have the same definitions of MQL, SAL, SQL? We tend to find more times than not that there is misalignment, so making sure everybody's on the same page. The second is building a bottoms-up model. What do we mean by a bottoms-up model? This is essentially saying, based upon what we've done historically, so trailing 12 months, what can we do, right? If we've closed one at 25%, our close win rate should be at 25%. So making sure you're taking historical data points and building the bottoms-up model. The other important note here is making sure this is not just a sales version of the bottom-up. So just looking at sales capacity, but it's also looking at what has marketing done historically? What have the BDRs done historically? What has the CS team done historically? Like, I know we like the joke about forgetting the marketing team, but we oftentimes forget CS as well. The third is what I mentioned at the beginning. So this is normally the top down, right? What does the board want to grow at, right? This is normally how capacity planning gets done. But, so this is kind of typically what we see already. The fourth bucket is what we call the oh shit meeting. There's typically 2 oh shits meetings, and we'll talk about it. But the first oh shit meeting is when you marry that top down and bottoms up, 99 times out of 100, they don't line up. So it's trying to figure out how can we align what we want to try and drive at from the board perspective with what we've done historically. The last bucket, and this gets overlooked on a regular basis, and I know Alex alluded to it, and we'll get into tactics around how to do this, but is once you've stacked hands on all of the targets, and it's not just the sales targets, but all the targets up and down the funnel, then you need to communicate it out, and you need to set up a process in which you hold everybody accountable and continually track against those targets. So we're going to get into each of these, but this is the kind of 5 steps that we see in the process.
Love it.
All right. Still very quiet in the chat. Anyways, feel free to ask questions. Let's quickly talk timeline. Alex has alluded to this a couple of times. When should you start your capacity planning? The answer is it depends. Capacity planning should actually, the process should be dynamic. What do we mean by that? In a perfect world, capacity planning should be based upon your sales cycle. What I mean by that, if you have a 3-month sales cycle, your capacity planning should be done, everybody stacking hands, communicate it out by the end of September. The reason being is all of the pipeline you're creating in October, November, and December is the pipeline you're going to ultimately close win in Q1 of next year. So if you have a 4-month sales cycle, it should have been done at the end of August, so on and so forth. Now, one of the questions we get asked a lot when we present the slide is like, what if we have a 6-month or a 12-month sales cycle? Well, we know that can be challenging. And you're not going to be doing capacity planning for FY25 in March of this year, right, if it's a 9-month sales cycle. So typically what we recommend are 2 things. 1, start as early as you can. So in a perfect world, you're finishing things in August or September. And 2, you need to then be thoughtful about, all right, we're not going to have as many levers to be able to impact close win at the beginning part of FY25. So what are the things that we can do that may have a shorter sales cycle, right? Expansion. What are we doing with our open pipeline? Do we run close loss campaigns to try and drive stuff that may have had intent back in the day? So thinking about the things that you can do to add some levers to drive more pipeline that can theoretically close in the early part of next year.
So I want to jump in here. You're making some really good points, and Taylor just asked a really thoughtful question, right? So what are the typical friction points in these oh shit meetings? And I chuckled because you named a bunch of them, right? But let's just pit marketing and sales against each other because it's the common dynamic that every company sees, right? Let's say that we want marketing. Let's say that in 2024, marketing sourced 40% of your pipeline. And in 2025, we want that to jump to 60%. We're going to fight about budget. We're going to say, okay, well, are we getting a commensurate increase in budget? The answer is probably no. So then where are we going to get that throughput? And that's where it comes from things like, okay, well, what can we control? We can control volume of demand. We can control quality of demand. We can control conversion rates, and we can influence velocity ASP. But this is where the conversations really need to be had. Is let's just say that the 2024 MQL, marketing qualified lead to pipeline conversion rate was 20%. But in order to make the math work in the Excel model, that needs to jump to 40%. That's a massive increase. So then that head of marketing, demand gen, and the head of business and development need to figure out, okay, well, what are the actual tactics? What are the assumptions that we're going to make that are actually going to influence that decision? And then the big piece here is you can't just agree to it in the room, put in 40% in your Excel model, and then say, okay, we're good to go. You need to document that assumption. And then over time, and we'll get to this shortly, track that assumption over time. If right now that MQL to pipeline conversion rate is 20%, but we know that by the end of February, beginning of March, that needs to be at closer to 40. If we're still in that 24, 25% range, that's a problem. That's a red flag. We need to raise that because it has downstream impacts. And that goes to this point that Reese has made a couple times, which is this capacity planning process needs to be dynamic, right? You can't just set it in October and then say, okay, we're good to go. You need to be revisiting these assumptions regularly.
It's a great point, and we're going to get into specifics of how to track this moving forward, because we have a very opinionated way to do this. The other thing, Taylor, I love the question. The oh shit meeting is like, I've sat in this 1,000 times. There's this amazing thing that happens when executives realize that what they've already communicated to the board does not meet kind of what we've done historically. And it's like, oh, how do we bridge that gap?
Yep.
So a couple of like do's and don'ts about this process. One, if for some reason, you've agreed to targets or, something like that, and the bottoms up numbers can't align, it's important to be able to go back to the board and have the honest conversation now as versus middle of next year of essentially, hey, we're off track, we're going to miss these numbers. It's much better to kind of set that expectation early and upfront.
That's right.
Second is like, make sure that this is not just a CEO and finance process.
Yeah.
The heads of these different departments, so RevOps, sales, BDR, marketing, CS, need to be involved in this process because you're ultimately setting their targets, which you should, in a perfect world, align their comp strategy to.
Yep.
So everybody's running the same process.
Awesome. Cool. So one of the things that's near and dear to my heart here is getting your definitions right. So one of the building blocks to an accurate capacity planning model is getting your customer journey codified and defined correctly within whatever your tech stack looks like. So this is a view of, an example template that we use with a lot of our clients for defining life cycle stages, right? We don't need to use these exact words. We don't need to use these exact stages. But the point here is we've defined a marketing qualified lead. We've defined the entrance criteria, what the required automation looks like, what's the system of record, exactly how are we going to track it, what are the key reports that we're going to use to report on this. The reason this is so important is it's just like it's easy to make that cell in Excel, say 40% and not 20%. It's easy for a marketing leader or a sales leader just to show up and say, yeah, I can source 1,000 MQLs. That's no problem. Well, what if my definition of an MQL doesn't align with the head of sales definition of a MQL, right? That's one of the number one pain points that we see people make is most sales leaders think that a marketing qualified lead is a demo request from an executive at a target account. Sure, that's great. And if I solved out how to, only drive those types of leads, I would not be sitting here with you today. I would be sitting on my yacht in somewhere. So we have to find a common ground, right? So most marketing teams will say, okay, well, I can source leads from target accounts, but maybe they're going to be managers or directors. They're not going to be in that VP suite. Does that count as a marketing qualified lead? We need to have that conversation. That's not a quick conversation either. Now, maybe your go-to-market team is more aligned than others, but more often than not, getting this right takes quite a bit of time. And then again, it's one thing to agree on definitions written down in a Google presentation. It's another thing to then take this, build this out within your system so that it's automated, so that it's trusted. The very next thing is you need to have reports, source of truth reports that are based on all of these definitions. So if Reese comes into a meeting and says, Alex, you miss your MQL number, I can look at his filters and say, you're not pulling this report correctly. We all agreed 3 months ago, this is how we define an MQL. You're using the wrong field. You no longer get an opinion.
And how many of us have sat in that meeting of like, where the meeting is actually supposed to be about what we're doing, but the meeting then devolves into like, oh, Alex, your definition of an MQL is X and my definition is Y. And you just waste everybody's time on that.
That's right. Another good question just came up. How often are we revisiting definitions? Let's actually go to the next slide here because I think it'll be a nice way to frame this. So this is essentially the sales version of the previous slide, right? So this is an example stage advancement criteria for a deal process or an opportunity process, right? Again, it's the same thing. It's stage definitions, forecast percentages, forecast categories, who the owners are, what the required entrance criteria is. I would say that we should be confirming these definitions as well as your customer journey definitions every quarter. Whether or not they require a change, I think is very specific to changes in your go-to-market strategy. For example, if you have been one of those fortunate companies that have, really only ever relied on inbound, and now you're having to stand up outbound, you're going to need to define, well, how do we define a sales qualified lead if it didn't come in from marketing? So you're going to need to account for that. So I would say revisit these every quarter. But if mid-quarter you're seeing a change in your go-to-market strategy, you need to make sure that the underlying processes and systems and data account for that, so that when you're looking at the number of stage 1 deals in discovery, that is actually indicative of the number of deals that are in that stage.
And just to double click on that point there,
Yeah.
I would be highly, highly, highly careful about changing. You can look at it on a quarterly, but be highly careful about changing it.
Yeah.
The reason being is if you're changing it every quarter, trying to run quarter over quarter, month over month historicals against it's impossible, because then all of a sudden you're doing this an MQ met this 2 quarters ago, and now means to Alex's point, you're only changing it when there's material changes in your go-to-market strategy. Yeah. So you're looking at it, you're being thoughtful of it, but you may not change it for 18 months, right? Things like that.
Yep. Spot on.
Cool. All right. Marrying the top down versus the bottom up. We've talked a lot about this. So you've figured out the process. You've started with stage definitions, right? The stage definitions, as Alex mentioned, this is your common language. This is your Rosetta Stone for being able to communicate internally about what is going on. So building a bottoms up capacity plan. There's a couple of very important things. So we always recommend starting with the bottoms up. A couple of things. One, it should not just be a sales bottoms up. This needs to include marketing, needs to include BDR, sales, CS, any other important stakeholders within this, right? Two, as you think about it, you want to pull historical data. So your assumptions should start in the historical data.
Yep.
And the historical data should be based upon, normally we recommend trailing 12 months. Really, you can go back as far as if there was a material change in your go-to-market strategy, let's say 6 months ago, you materially changed things, I would pull the data up until that point and start there with it. So if your quota attainment was 75%, you pull that for 75%. You want to make sure that these things are connected. A couple of other important things you want to take into account. One, make sure you include ramp period for salespeople, BDR, CS people, right? Yeah. You can't just have them, at 100% quota, right off the bat. Two, I think it's also important to understand sales cycle. I think one of the major challenges people get, and that was the comment we were making back in the timeline of things, right? So if you're trying to close $1 million in Q1 and you have a 25% close rate, which means you need $4 million of pipe, you need $4 million of pipe showing up. Let's assume you have a 90-day, or let's assume you have a 90-day sales cycle. You need $4 million of pipe showing up January 1. It can't be halfway through the quarter. So you need to take into account the sales cycle here. So building the bottoms up across those 14, assuming a ramp across the key individuals, it needs to be interconnected, and you need to assume kind of sales cycles. We have a couple of examples of this, and we can kind of show this when we get into Q&A. Happy to kind of walk through an example of some capacity plan templates and so on and so forth.
One of the things I want to drill down on here is the importance of being able to do this bottoms up analysis by channel, right? So for example, outbound versus inbound pipeline at the highest level, right? Being able to provide the bottoms up conversion rates, bottoms up volume, bottoms up velocity is really important. And then even within inbound, being able to get into your attribution data to understand that demand that comes from events, for example, converts at a different rate, slower, faster than demand that converts in from paid search, for example. You want to be able to have that data because, again, you need, from a marketing perspective and honestly from a CFO perspective, you need to understand when you're going to see the ROI on the investments you're making. You need to be able to understand that if I invest in this big Q4 event strategy, but we know that events take more than 90 days to convert into pipeline, all of a sudden that Q4 event isn't going to be impacting your Q1 pipeline. And if that was the big strategy that's going to get you there, you've just completely missed the mark. So being able to do this on a granular level is going to go a long way into the forecast accuracy.
Could not agree more. All right. We've mentioned the oh shit meetings, right? Typically there are two oh shit meetings. So what happens is you build this bottoms up, and then all of a sudden the board, some executive somewhere has said, oh, hey, normally they're at a board meeting, they're not paying attention. And all of a sudden someone's asking like, what should the number be next year? They look up from the computer like, let's go by, 60%, right? Very scientific. So then they come back to the team and it's like, all right, 60% is what the board wants to grow by next year. You need to overlay that against the bottoms up.
Yeah.
I can almost guarantee you when you overlay it against the bottoms up, you are going to have a delta. They're not going to match, meaning what you've done historically is not going to get you to what the board wants to do. So a couple of different things here. The reason why we call it the oh shit meeting, we alluded to this earlier, the look on different people's faces when they get in the meeting and realize this. Now, the good news is if you're at least having the oh shit meeting, you at least can do something about it. If you're not having the oh shit meeting, it's even worse because then you have the second oh shit meeting, which is the vastly worst meeting, which that meeting happened 6 months into FY25. And all of a sudden you realize like, hey, we're not going to hit the number, right? So that's the second one. You want to avoid that one. Yep. Inside of the first one, it's important not just to have the CEO, CFO. It's important to have all the key stakeholders because this is where everybody starts to kind of sit down and say, all right, what can we sign up for to try and bridge this gap? And to Alex's earlier point, it's important not to just do fun in Excel, but to understand to have initiatives.
Yep.
So let's say that you've closed one historically, your S1 pipeline to close one at 25%. Maybe the sales leader raises his or her hand and says, hey, look, I can sign up for 27.5%. What I'm going to do to try and get us there is I think our biggest issues in closed winning is we haven't done a good job in and around multi-threading. I'm going to run a Q1 certification program around multi-threading. I'm going to document that it's around multi-threading, and then we add that as 27.5%. Maybe Alex on the marketing team says, hey, look, we're going to sign up for a 20% increase in MQLs. We're going to get there by doing strategy A, B, and C. All right, we're going to document A, B, and C. All right. BDR team says, hey, look, I know our comp plan is historically we set a meeting a week. We're going to increase that to a meeting a half a week. How we're going to get there is bam, bam, bam. So everybody needs to kind of sign up for this, and you need to document those assumptions, and that's what goes into the ongoing tracking of it. And then you can see there's like, are we ultimately able to marry the top down with the bottoms up? Couple of just like do's and don'ts as you're going through this, right? We already talked about the hard conversation with the board. If you're doing things, Alex has alluded to this, don't use hope as a strategy. I think it's very important that like, as you're going through this, talk about what's real, like increasing a close win rate from like 15% to 30%. I'm going to tell you right now is not going to happen. So like let's come up with reasonable assumptions and the initiatives you're going to run after you've kind of documented everything.
Awesome.
All right.
Cool. Yeah.
So, aligning the entire go-to-market team. So, what is the classic CEO mistake? Alex and I have been at companies where this has happened, and we've worked now with several companies where this has happened. So, one of the classic mistakes is board says they want to grow by 60%. And then what the CEO comes back and does is they essentially say, all right, how do we need to hire enough salespeople to make sure we have enough sales capacity on the street to be able to hit that number? And then they stop there. And that is all that they do. They don't marry the hiring of those additional salespeople with adding additional marketing investment, adding BDR heads. Then the downstream, we always forget our friends in CS. How is that going to impact if we actually grow by 60%? Are we going to need more onboarding resources? Are we going to need more CSMs? What does that look like? So being able to marry that. One important note here as you think about this, when you think of the marketing spend, this is not just like programmatic spend of like, Alex, I'm giving you another $1 million to go blow on Google Ads, right? It's thinking about things like content. How do you deliver that? Demand generation. Do you need more systems? All that type of good stuff.
Yeah, one of the crucial things here, again, I keep coming back to this, but is like understanding velocity and ramp. So if it's hiring a new sales team, uh, how long is it going to take them to ramp? If it's starting a new demand gen channel, how long is it going to take you to gain traction there? If it's launching this big event, when is it's again, it's thinking about the timing. It's not necessarily, all right, we put money out there in the field and now it's happening. It's think about when the pipeline actually shows up.
One last point here,
Yeah.
as you're thinking about this, is when you get everybody aligned here, one of the outputs that should come out of this is, all right, let's say that you can marry the top down and the bottoms up, and you do agree to 60%. And part of that is some increased budget with marketing, things like that. The marketing team owes you, as a part of this process, some sort of Q1 campaigns calendar, right? And what the campaigns calendar is like, hey, these are the 2, 3, 4 major, themes that we're going to be communicating against. These are all our channels: paid search, paid social, events, webinar, content, boom, 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 boom. We are doing these activities across all this. And this is how we're going to spend the money, where we're going to spend it, and what we think we're going to get from that money to ultimately drive against the MQL numbers, the SAL numbers that marketing is associated with.
And the very next thing that we're going to be jumping into here is something that is near and dear to our heart. One of my old bosses and a good friend of ours coined this term, demand council. So this is we've alluded to this more than a few times here, right? So demand council is essentially the process through which we hold ourselves accountable to those assumptions within the capacity plan. This is how we know every single week, hey, Alex, you said you were going to go diversify your paid media budget and you were going to go start retargeting on LinkedIn because you think you could get a higher conversion rate and higher quality, though at a higher cost. It's been 3 months. We're not seeing that materialize within the funnel. Do we need to right size? Reese, I know this was your slide. I just got passionate about it, so I'll.
No, I appreciate the passion. If you only take a couple of things away from today's webinar, one of the big things that I would take away is like you need a process in which to track your targets coming out of your capacity plan. Demand council, which Alex has talked about, this is one of the most successful things that we have seen. We've done it with countless customers. And as Alex mentioned, you take the targets coming out of your capacity plan, and it's not just your close win targets, right? It's everything from MQL, SAL, SQL, all the way down to close one. You look at conversion rates, and you essentially look at things week over week, and you break it down by channel. So marketing source, AE source, SDR source, and by segment, right? If you have mid-market, enterprise, whatever that looks like. And the whole goal behind it is to essentially say, are we on track or are we off track? And if we are off track, is it a amount of demand at the top of the funnel? Is it a conversion issue, or is it an ASP issue? Or is it some combination of the three? And where is that happening? And then what are we going to do about it? Alex, go ahead.
This is going to be a little plug for revenue operations, but this meeting needs to be run by Switzerland, somebody that can be objective, right? So not your marketing operations person that reports to your head of demand gen, not by the sales operations person that reports to the VP of sales. This needs to be run by revenue operations, because revenue operations is just essentially working for the entire go-to-market team here. So we need to be able to have the hard conversations. So this is a weekly recurring meeting that is looking at all this data that, again, are based on the source of truth reports that everybody in the room has already agreed to, that are based on all the definitions that we talked about earlier, right? And every week it's like, okay, MQLs are supposed to be, at 100 now. We're only at 80. Why is there a gap? Where is that gap coming from? Oh, it looks like this bet that we made in Google isn't working, though we do need to give it another few weeks to understand whether or not it's a channel thing, a campaign thing, or if it's really just not going to work. Okay, take that note, take that action item. We are going to let this spend run for another 3 weeks before we turn off. Again, it's a big accountability meeting, and it's going to feel uncomfortable for a while, especially if the MC of the meeting is a little junior and is maybe a little timid. But over time, you can build a lot of trust amongst the team if you show up to this meeting with just empathy and wanting to do the right thing, right? Again, it's like we're all running towards the same goals here. And what you don't want to do is get into a pissing match between, well, I hit my number and you missed yours, so this is your fault. It's like it's all one go-to-market team. We're all, and this goes back to comp, we're all comped on hitting the big number. If I'm the head of demand gen, I shouldn't be comped on the number of marketing and qualified leads, because I could hit that and sales could still miss their number, right? So this is, again, a weekly recurring meeting you want to be having with your top minds. And again, it needs to be based on the source of truth reports.
So there's a good question in the chat. Taylor asked essentially, is this planning done in a spreadsheet? Is this planning done in a spreadsheet? So what's interesting is to make this meeting successful, we work with a number of customers who are like, oh, we have a version of this, but like it's not super successful. Part of this is one of the major issues, and this is what we found over doing this a lot and stubbing our toe about 1,000 times, is you should not have the meeting out of a spreadsheet. We always have the meeting out of a PowerPoint, and we ask a couple of questions, right? Yeah. Are you on track or are you off track? If you are off track, why are you off track and what are you doing about it? And then what help do you need from the team? And a second thing that's important about this is you want to make different individuals, departments, DRIs responsible for the data and the ownership, meaning the marketing source pipeline, that is a readout from Alex. Alex owns that readout. So RevOps MCs it, they give the state of the state. Alex MCs the marketing side. Taylor MCs the sales side. We get, Grady to MC the CS side, all that type of stuff. What it does, it creates ownership in their different departments. And they will then start to be able to have this kind of cross-functional thing of like, oh, hey, Alex, we're a little off here. What are your thoughts? Could you add another webinar to like help out our enterprise team? When you start to get questions like that, that's when you're starting to get the goodness from this meeting.
The answer is no, we can't do another webinar, because from a marketing ops perspective, they're a pain in the ass to run and get off the ground. So no, I will not run another webinar, Reese.
We have a couple examples of Demand Council. If you got any other questions about it, we can flash up an example here in a few minutes.
Yep.
Walk through specifics on that.
Cool. So to wrap up, we always try to, not just be the consultants that give you a bunch of fancy slideware that don't actually tell you what to do. So we're trying to give you a sort of order of operations checklist here, right? So if you take nothing else, take this screenshot. We will send over the deck and the recording to everybody afterwards as well. But essentially, these are the sort of forcing functions, right? This is what must be true in a very specific order in order to execute on what we've talked about here. Now, I know that we've really hit home on the timeline here. If you are behind, it's okay. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're even open to having this conversation is a huge improvement, right? Like Reese said, there are 2 oh shit meetings, and the second one is worse. The second meeting is in June, when you realize you have really no shot of hitting the FY25 number because of your velocities and your ASPs and everything. It's just, it's too late. So you'd rather have the first oh shit meeting, realizing you're behind and you need to make adjustments in your hiring, adjustments in your demand investments, adjustments in your strategy, your certification processes, whatever it ends up being. Have the first oh shit meeting and it'll save you the second.
With that, we can open it up to questions. We can also dive into kind of some examples of an actual capacity plan and show everybody examples of what we're talking about. We'll start with questions, and then we're happy to kind of dive into capacity plan, demand council, kind of what some of those models and processes look like. What questions?
Or critiques. Reese talked a lot. I'm sure he got a couple things wrong.
not more than a couple things. So
Excited to see an example. Cool.
all right, Aaron, you want to see an example? Any other questions? All right, why don't we start? Yes, I was ignored as a child very often.
That's great. I love that.
One of our love languages here at Domestique is shit talking. That we enjoy that quite a bit. So this is an example of a capacity plan of what we're talking about. A couple of things just to orient everybody. Blue numbers are inputs. So as you think about assumptions, all of the blue numbers, these are assumptions in the model. Black numbers are outputs, right? These are eventually going to be your targets. You'll see on here that we have 4 tabs. We have sales, demand gen, BDR, onboarding/CS. All of the tabs are interconnected. So if we make a change in one tab, it affects all of the other tabs. So this is a true bottoms-up model here. What you can see here is in this example, we have 3 teams. We have a SMB team, a mid-market team, and an enterprise team. We have their different ramp schedules. They're all set the same, but we can go in and change them super easy. And then we have the ability to change kind of attainment, so on and so forth. So what you can do here is you can go in and add different headcounts. Like, all right, let's go ahead and add an SMB here, and they're going to start 4/1/2025. What you can see here is all of a sudden, this shows the ramp schedule. You've then got quota capacity. So this shows 100% of their quota capacity. And then what this shows is their quota attainment based upon those attainment numbers. So it's based upon these attainment numbers. And what you get here is essentially you get the bookings number. Now this assumes you have the pipeline there, right? The other thing we've done in here is we've put in the board number. Like, all right, what is the board number? Well, now we have to marrying the top down with the bottoms up to essentially say, does the attainment achieve the board number? If you have negative numbers, that's bad. Positive numbers, that's good. So this would essentially say, hey, in Q1 of next year, we're targeted to, based upon what we've done historically, we're targeted to miss the board number by 270K. Now the conversation becomes, all right, what can we do about it? All right, so that's the sales side. On the demand gen side, so what we do with the sales side is we take 100% quota capacity, because an important note here is your pipeline generation activities should be tied to creating enough pipeline where reps can hit 100% of their quota, not whatever attainment number it is, right? Because you as the organization owe it to the reps to try and drive enough pipeline where they can hit 100% of their quota. So you can see here, we've got our 3 channels, or we've got our 3 teams, and this example has 3 channels. So there's a inbound sourced, SDR outbound, and AE outbound. And we've got kind of, here's the breakdown of this. So it's a 95/5, and then we have our different conversion rates. So this is stage 1 to close 1, demo complete to stage 1, demo set, and queue up. And as what you can see here is this starts to show you how much pipeline dollars you need, either at a total basis, you need 1.6, but then it breaks it out to essentially say, hey, Alex, Mr. Mrs. Marketing Team, we need $1.44 million from you in January of next year. Okay, we're gonna need $80,000 from the SDR team. And it breaks it out by where the pipeline should show up from a segment, and then it works up the waterfall. So it goes stage 1 units, demo completes, demo sets, and MQLs. We then have the BDR tab, which is set up the exact same way as the sales tab. So you've got a ramp schedule, you've got an attainment schedule, so you can put different individuals in here. Let's add an SMB. We'll have them start 1/1/25. They'll go ahead and start there. And what you can see here is whether this is a demo set. This then shows your demo set capacity and your demo set attainment. We then link that to the demand gen tab to essentially say how much SDR outbound demo sets do we need? Do we have enough reps in there or not? You can see in this example, and again, we're just messing around with numbers. We don't have enough SDRs and we need to hire. The last thing we do in here is we link the CS tab back to essentially the sales tab and essentially the attainment, and divide the attainment by your ASPs to essentially get how many units or individual customers would theoretically be showing up. And so on, you can then start to predict when and how would you need to hire onboarding resources as well as CSM resources. So what this then does at the end of the day is it does a couple things. 1, it gives you your hiring plan for sales, BDR, CS. 2, It creates your targets all the way up the waterfall from close one to SAL to SQL to dollars, all that type of stuff. 3, it marries the top down with the bottoms up, so you know if you're on track or off track. And now you can start to have the oh shit meeting to start to say, all right, we're slightly off here. Let's go ahead and change this assumption, but we're going to do this and document this. I know there are a bunch of questions that popped up, so I'll stop there. And Alex, you want to start firing away on questions?
No, this is great. I love it. So Alana asked, can we elaborate on best practices for reviewing assumptions quarterly? What metrics or indicators should we prioritize? So this very much depends on what the assumptions are. For example, if our bet, yeah, exactly. And these should be where your assumptions are baked, right? So if we're saying, well, we're expecting to be able to increase the MQL to pipeline conversion rate by 20% by April of 2025, you need to be tracking that. If you are saying you are going to be adjusting the pipeline mix, the ratio, meaning how much is coming inbound, how much is outbound, you need to be able to track that. If you're saying we're going to be able to increase ASPs, particularly from marketing, because we're going to be targeting slightly different accounts, you need to be able to track that here. And then, of course, everything by segment, right? A big play we often see is we're going to move up market. We're going to start targeting enterprise. We're going to start gaining traction there. You need to be able to track that. So hopefully that answers that question.
And one just add.
Yeah, please.
What we recommend with the capacity plan, you're gonna create it. You're gonna stack hands on it here in FY24. Once a quarter, go back and look at what did you do the previous quarter to essentially say, hey, our assumption was that SMB marketing ASP were $25,000. Well, is it in spitting distance? All right, it was $24,000. All right, close enough. Or was it $10,000? All right, it's way off. Why was it way off, and what do we need to change? You can then dynamically change your capacity plan. You need to keep in line what are you driving towards, and that's where that demand council becomes so important.
Spot on. Ashley asked, if your company is pre-revenue or just really early stage, are there strategies to build bottoms-up plan when that 12-month trailing data is limited? Absolutely. A lot of it comes down to the quality of your go-to-market hires, right? And their ability to rely on previous experience and also any sort of relevant case studies that are specific to your industry or your product, right? Which actually kind of bleeds into one of Rob's questions around ramp time varying by product, right? Because this is not all capacity plans and not all assumptions are created equal, right? If you are a commercial sales, high velocity, high volume, low ASP play, the model and the assumptions are going to look very different than if you are an outbound enterprise, high ASP sales where you need to do multi-threading and the sales cycle takes 9-12 months. So hopefully that addresses both those questions. But again, just to drill in on the first question, you really want to be able to rely on best practices. And all of this data is out there. You can look at average conversion rates, average ASPs, for different industries, different types of products. Look at competitors that are doing something similar. And again, overlay it with the sort of boots on the ground expertise. If you've hired a director of sales and a director of demand gen in the early days, and they're telling you that they're not going to be able to hit whatever the pipeline numbers are, okay, well, what can they hit? Why can they hit it? Again, it's just about getting specific. And then Rob, to your, Reese, no, please go ahead.
I was just going to add one note to Rob's question.
We're on the same.
If your product is aligned to one of your segments, meaning, this product is going to greatly affect the enterprise team more than the mid-market team, one of the things we've done is you're going to essentially show jumps in your assumptions, i.e. ASPs are going to go for the enterprise teams, or we're going to close win more for the enterprise teams. Later on, as that product comes online, let's say the product gets released in March, you may not want to show it right in Q2, but maybe you should show it beginning in Q3. So you start to kind of layer that in, and then that's again, while every quarter you go back and look at those assumptions and figure out, was that on track or off track, and how do we align that to make sure it's close?
Yeah, spot on. One of the next questions here from Rob is, what is the typical mix between what you should expect from outbound calls efforts versus inbound marketing generation efforts? I'm going to give the classic annoying answer, which is it very much depends. Yeah, I mean, it very much depends on the product you're selling, the channels you're relying on. That being said, best practice that we've seen from most sort of B2B tech SaaS companies, if you can get to 60% of your marketing source, or sorry, 60% of your pipeline coming from marketing, that's fantastic. But again, every company's at a different starting point. Some companies are 100% inbound now and need to stand up outbound. Some companies are 100% outbound and they need to stand up inbound. The big thing that I'll say here is they both take longer to stand up than you imagine. They both take a lot longer to stand up. If you want to stand up a paid search campaign, but you don't have any organic SEO and your website isn't SEO optimized, you're looking at a 6-month timeline until you're really starting to actually see LTV to CAC friendly conversions there. You can always bully your way into the market with spend, but if you want to do it appropriately, give it time. One of the next questions from Taylor: as the year goes on, how do you show the forecasted versus actual and deltas for each of these? Demand council, baby. That's a good question.
Let's switch to demand council, because this is a great segue here.
Yep.
So this is demand council. This is, again, I made the statement, if you take one or two things away from it, if you do not currently have a process today tracking your conversion rates, if you set up a process, I guarantee you will have a better chance of hitting your targets for next year. So what demand council is here, you can see here, we have two segments in this example. We have a mid-market segment, we have an enterprise segment. In this example, we have a couple of different pipeline sources. So SDR outbound, inbound, AE outbound, and expansion. So there's 4 pipeline sources. So the capacity plan should match this, right? What you see here in column C, these are the goals coming out of the capacity plan. What is your quarterly goal? And you see that we've broken it down to like pipeline source by SAL by team, like mid-market enterprise, right? Because this is how you start to get there. Quarter to date shows you where you're at today. Your quarter to date goal is just essentially taking your quarterly goal and saying, hey, we're halfway through the quarter, so like take half of the goal. And then you can start to say, where are you to pace and how are you pacing? Because what this allows you to then do is quickly come in and essentially say, all right, if I scroll down here to the totals, right? I can show us that, hey, look, we are slightly off pace for stage $1, but we're not materially off pace here. We are kind of like way off pace on kind of our demo set and demos held, but the reason why that we're still on pace for kind of our S1 is because we're overperforming on ASPs. So you can start to immediately like dive down to that. And then you can start to say, all right, where would we need to kind of spend some time? It's like, all right, let's go into this. Man, our SDR outbound, we're way outpaced. Do we have enough capacity? Are we targeting the right people? Is the messaging correct? Hey, let's take action items for next week to talk about those. On the inbound side, MQLs are doing great, but our SALs are not great. Our MQL to SAL conversion rate is garbage. What's going on there? Alex, next week, I want you to kind of look in A, B, and C. AE outbound, kind of the same situation. And then you can break it down into the individual teams. Again, this is a template of ours, which is why you see the yellow in here. And you can start to say, all right, this issue seems to be related just to the mid-market team. This issue seems to be related just to the enterprise team. We mentioned that this should only be done, the meeting should only be had in a PowerPoint. So the way that the meeting typically runs is you start off, you review the action items from the previous week. I'll slideshow this for everybody. You run the action items from the previous week. Alex hates that because I always forget the slideshow. Then you give the state of the state. All right, this is from RevOps Switzerland. Hey, where are we at? Are we on track or off track? If we're off track, is it ASP, demand, conversion? Where is it showing up by channel and by segment? And then we go through the readout. All right, if we're below target, where are we below? Why are we below? What are the initiatives you're working on, and what are the questions you have? And then we just go through each of the pipeline sources. So they all each give a readout of this. And then you're documenting the action items. And the whole goal of RevOps or Switzerland is to be able to add questions, pepper it in there, help drive people to have the conversation that you need to have. Because like, it's fine that you are off track. You'd much rather be able to be off track, but to talk about it than to be off track and not talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, great overview of this. I think the most effective demand councils that we see often have some of the more contentious conversations, right? You will have failed if demand council is just a data readout with no meaningful questions, no pushback. You jump onto the call, each team gives their readout, you get off. You want to see some lively debate in here. You want to see people problem solving live. And again, you want to be able to document those next steps. And then again, one of our company values is, being accountable. It's like you want to be able to be accountable. You want to be able to, and again, RevOps needs to be in a position of influence within the business to be able to hold people accountable, right? So if your marketing leader says that they're going to go adjust their ad targeting parameters to start targeting a different group, make sure that they've actually done that, right? You want to see the change week over week. Otherwise, this is just a meeting for a meeting's sake. So hopefully this was helpful. Thank you so much for joining. This was great. This was one of our first live webinars we've done. So this was a lot of fun. If you have any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat now or chime in now if you want to chime in. We will be sending this presentation as well as the recording to all of you who showed up today.
Awesome.
Okay. And thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.